Thank you for coming. I hope your isolation's going well. Mine is doing all right. I'm surviving. I think my family's sick of me, but that's okay. Um, just right off the top, I'd like to say that this is going to take about 30 minutes. That's kind of the format that we settled on. And then after that, I'll answer any questions that you have. So put them in the chat, and then I'll go through and I'll read them all one by one. Today's webinar is going to be about the basics. So that's useful if you've shot a few iGUIDEs already, or if you haven't shot any. If you haven't shot any, this will be really useful. But if you've already shot some, you might pick up something that you didn't originally know, which could be quite cool. So I'm going to walk you guys through the camera, some parts on it, just so we know what we're talking about in terms of terminology. I'm going to give you some tips. We're going to talk about the process of shooting. This system is like a Swiss Army knife. Like there's lots of different ways you can use it. So I'm going to tell you the way that I think is best. It's not necessarily the best way for you. So I already know like 100% that a bunch of people are going to ask me questions about automatic mapping mode in the chat. So I'm not even going to go into that. I'm going to cover it later. I will cover it. We'll talk about it today, but I'll do that when the questions come up. So we're going to talk about optimal workflow from my perspective. And I've got reasons, which I'll tell you as well. And then I'm going to very briefly talk about Stitch and then talk about submitting data. Working in Stitch and submitting data are very fast things. So there's a lot of things you can do there, but those are kind of separate webinars. This is really more sort of camera and shooting and optimal workflow when on site. And I'm just going to sort of briefly mention Stitch and the iGUIDE portal. But if there's a lot of interest, I can totally do webinars on those because there's a lot of richness there in terms of features and stuff we can go through. All right, cool. So let's get rolling. What I'd like to do to start is load up a camera for you guys to look at. So Michael is on his way to my house with a camera, but he's not here yet. So I had to break out the virtual camera. So I have this camera here. It's not real. And I'm going to show you some parts on it, and we're going to talk about it. So the camera system is pretty funky. Yeah, I have guitars. Yeah, I'm glad someone noticed that. I put them there just to make me look cool. Sorry, I was reading the chat prematurely. Either way, the camera system itself has a lot of interesting parts on it. They're all kind of relevant, especially to someone who's sort of new and doesn't know exactly what they're looking at. So I might reference these parts while I'm talking today. So I'm just going to identify them real quick just so we're all on the same page when I say something like system controller. So this big box on the side of the camera that has the logo on it, it's a big aluminum box. It's important, one, because it has the power button on top. So when you want to turn the camera on, you have to push that. But it's also important because it's like the brains. It's the computer that controls everything. It does all the HDR processing, and it connects to the Wi-Fi and the USB storage. It's doing all the processing. So the camera is really just like a sensor in a box. So I'll just rotate this around. And this is nothing you haven't seen before. It's a DSLR. But the DSLR isn't really doing anything. So even though it's always going to be set to manual mode, that doesn't mean you're manually adjusting the camera. So that's a common thing that comes up when people first start. They say, well, if it's in manual, do I have to do anything? The answer is no, you don't. The system controller is doing everything. And you can think of it, you guys might have experience with this, you can think of it like tethered shooting. So if you connect your camera to a laptop, you're just transferring the controls to the laptop. You're just not using the controls on the physical controls on the camera. And this is the same, except the computer's basically strapped to the side. The other thing I'll point out while we're looking at the front is the lens. So the lens is a bit of a freak. It's very exotic. So it sees in 185 degrees in all directions, but that includes up and down. So another common question when people first start is, oh, I can see the tripod. Is that a problem? The answer is no, it's not a problem at all. That is totally normal. When the 360 images get created, when the three fisheyes are stitched together, you can look all the way up and you can look all the way down. You have that freedom with this system. Some systems don't allow you to do that. So it's an advantage to be able to see, in 185 degrees up and down. The tripod, you don't have to worry about as well because it's going to be covered by an image. So that's what we call a pano branding image, or it's sometimes referred to as a nadir image, which just means it's a circular image or square image, depending. That goes over the tripod area so that when you look down, you see the image and not the tripod. So also on the front, you get a good look at the rotator. So the nice thing about this camera is that it has a manual rotator on it, and they're tough as nails. It literally will last forever. I won't go into any great detail about it because it's just a rotator, but it allows the camera to free spin in 360 degrees with 3 natural resting points. So if you're brand spanking new and you just got your camera yesterday, this might sound a bit odd, but you'll get a feel for it by placing the camera on a tripod and then just rotating it. It will naturally click in to sort of 3 positions, and those are your 3 shot directions. So as I rotate the camera around here, you can start to see some more details. So there's a thing sticking out of the bottom of the system controller. You never need to touch this. You can actually kind of read it even. It says Panda Wireless. That's a wireless adapter. So that allows the camera to communicate with your smart device via Wi-Fi. And I'm going to clarify that connection right now. No external data is used. That is in no cellular data. So you don't have to be concerned if you don't get a good Wi-Fi connection. Think of the connection as being just between the camera and your smart device and nothing else. So, because another common question is, well, what if I'm out in the middle of nowhere and I can't get Wi-Fi? And the answer is, well, you don't need it. The camera provides the Wi-Fi connection for your smart device to connect to. So it's irrelevant where you are. It'll work on the moon. You know, probably. As I bring it around a little bit more, you can kind of see, it's kind of hard to see there, but that's the USB drive down there underneath the camera. So anyone who's literally just cracked their camera open out of the case, when you look at the case, you're going to see the USB drive will be sort of, facing upward. Fun fact, the case was designed very specifically with workflow in mind. So it's pretty fancy. So when the camera's in the case, you have access to everything you need when you get home right there. You don't have to pull the camera out, and that's how it was designed to save you some time. So when you look down at the camera in the case, you can see the USB drive. You can see the battery port, which isn't really visible here, but we'll get to that in a second. So you can charge the system battery. You can see the little door required to open on the DSLR to change the DSLR battery as well. So everything you need is right there. So typically when you get home, you would kind of crack the case open and then that's it. You plug it in and you grab all the things you need right there without having to lift it out of the case, which is very handy. So as I swing the camera around a little further, oh, sorry, I forgot to mention this. There's a DSLR body here. That's probably obvious, but that's what it is. You can almost see this too. There's a spirit level on top. The camera's not super fussy about being level, but it helps if you keep it relatively level throughout the shoot. But that's what that thing is up there. But anyway, as I swing the camera around, you can see this giant thing over here. This is what's called the system battery. So the system battery is the battery that powers the guts, like the system controller and the laser scanner. So the system battery, these batteries are very fancy. They're like used for really intense applications where reliability is really key. And the runtime on these is just nuts. Like it's like 8 to 10 hours easy. And we've shot lots of large properties where I didn't need to charge it. I could use it all day, 8 straight hours, and then go home and plug it in and then do the exact same thing the next day and so on and so forth. So very, very reliable. What you can't really see here is that on the bottom there's a charging port. So there's 2 batteries with the system, one that goes in the DSLR and you plug that into the wall charger, and the other gets plugged into the system battery. And it charges right in this sort of holster thing. So you never take this battery out, you just leave it in and charge it right in place. But then the last thing I'm going to point out is the star of the show, this thing up here. Whoops, sorry. That's what's doing the measuring. That's the laser scanner. So the laser scanner is a fancy LiDAR scanner that sends out invisible infrared laser beams in 270 degrees. And measures from the camera to whatever objects are within that range, about 3,200 times per space, or per pano that you create. So without that, none of this would, obviously work because you wouldn't have the reliable and accurate measurements. But that's not immediately obvious, right? Because you don't see anything come from this. So it's like, what is this thing? So that's what it is. It's a laser scanner. So one thing I do want to mention before we move on is that this hardware is all pretty robust. It's all connected together, and you're not usually going to have an issue with any of this stuff. But where this whole system connects to your tripod can be an issue, and it's come up a couple times lately, actually. So I don't know what kind of tripod you have. I hope it's sturdy. And it doesn't really matter what kind of tripod you have. We recommend that you have one that can hold the weight, 10 pounds or higher, and that you have one that you like, I guess. And the real critical thing isn't the tripod so much as the connection between the tripod and the rotator. So again, I can't show you exactly, but if you could see underneath the rotator at the bottom, you'd see there's a screw hole. It's a 1/4-inch screw hole. And you can connect that to a tripod directly, but almost no one ever does that. Typically, they connect it to a quick release plate. So I'm going to turn on my camera and show you one. Is it going to work for me? There we go. Okay, so here's a Manfrotto RC2 quick release plate. That's just going to go on the bottom of that rotator there if I were to connect it. So one of the things that happens when you use one of these is that you spin the camera around like I don't know, like 30 or 40 times at a property, and you do that for every property. And at some point, this will loosen and fall off. At some point, it's just a matter of time. And the reason is that you've got this rubber, there's a little bit of play there, that's totally normal. So you won't know when it's going to happen, but it can just destroy a shoot because you won't be thinking about it, right? You won't know that's going to come up. So maybe you do 25 houses, then it gets a little wobbly, and then all your panos, when you get home, you realize they're all off. The stitching's bad or the data's a little weird. So you can fix that right now if you want by taking your quick release plate, is that in focus, and ripping off the rubber part that you see there. And then when you screw it in, get some pliers, really crank it on. So if you do that, it will be nearly impossible to get off by hand, which is a downside if you need the plate back. But if you can sacrifice the plate, like you have an extra, like I've got a bunch of these ones, so I don't care. You can wreck the plate, not wreck it, but remove the rubber part, so it'll never really be the same unless you keep the rubber. And then screw it on real good, and then you won't have that problem. So 50, 60 houses down the line, it won't loosen up and wreck a shoot. It'll just keep working, forever. So that's a fun, quick tip for you. The other thing I wanted to talk about with regards to hardware is the battery. So everyone always asks me, hey, how many batteries should I get? And the answer is, well, as far as the system battery goes, you don't need more than one. Let me just put it on screen here. This battery is gigantic and reliable, and they literally last forever. As soon as it begins to fail, or if you're really desperate, I've never seen one fail, but let's pretend that you had a problem with it. You can go to this company right here if you don't want to order it from us, and you can order it directly from them anytime you want. So if you really, really want a backup, you can certainly get one if you feel like it. However, the Canon battery, you know what? They're all different. There's the smaller battery, so they're quite a bit cheaper. You could order one of those and run two and swap them out sort of as you go and be very comfortable. So what I mean by that is you have two batteries, you mark them 1 and 2, you run one until it's exhausted, and then you put it into charge, and then you pull out your second one. So this will save your bacon on shoots because you'll get halfway through a shoot and the battery will die, and then you'll have a spare. So my recommendation is, yes, get a second DSLR battery and then flip-flop them. And what you'll do is you'll prolong their longevity because you're having half the discharge cycles. So that means that your batteries will last, if you buy an extra one, they'll last twice as long, which is awesome. I mean, not exactly twice, but close enough. Alrighty, so what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about the most important thing that anyone needs to know, and that's how to shoot a single panorama. It sounds very simple, but really this camera system is extremely simple. I mean, it looks fancy and complicated, but it's not. It really just does one thing, and you just do it over and over and over again in a property until you've gone through every room, and then you go home. That's about all there is to it. There's a little bit more than that. We'll get to that, but for the most part, the most important thing you can do with this camera is create a rock solid panorama, because if you do that, you can fix almost everything else later. So we're going to talk about data alignment shortly, but if you don't properly align data on site, it's not a big deal. It doesn't break anything. It just means that you'll have to fix it later, which is a bit of a hassle for some people. But if you capture bad panoramas, you're out of luck. It's not going to work. You're not going to be able to save that data. So I'm going to describe verbally the process of shooting a panorama, and I'm going to use my fun virtual camera here. So shooting a panorama, best practices, looks a bit, or sounds a bit like this, I should say. So you would walk into a space, place the camera down, and my recommendation is always give it a little wiggle. If you get into a habit of doing that, you're gonna save yourself some hassle. And this is for people who've been shooting thousands of iGUIDEs, it's still good for them to do it. Because what happens is when you pick up the camera and you walk and you place it down, it's going to pop out of one of the divots on the rotator. It'll rotate a little bit is what I'm trying to say. So if it's not perfectly in one of those divots and you shoot, then when you rotate it around to the next position, you're going to find that your data won't align. The fancy term for it is non-overlapping scans. But what it means is that the data it won't be usable. So in order to get usable data, you'd have to then reshoot the panel or shoot another panel. So to avoid that, place the camera down, give it a little wiggle, and confirm that it is sitting in one of the three, notches or detents or shooting directions. Once you've got it in the proper, notch, it's a good idea to just look at the top of the camera and see that it's level. Like I said earlier, it's not fussy. You don't have to level it every single time. As long as it's close, you're good. And by close, I mean with the little bubble as close to the center of the ring on the spirit level as possible. So, I mean, that means a little bit different. That means something different to everyone. But when you're leveling something, you want it as close to the center in that spirit level bubble as possible. So after you've got that checked and you think, okay, we're good to go, you're going to press the +1 on your interface. So I also have, if I scroll down here, I don't know if you guys can see this yet. Oh, I have a survey interface sort of loaded up. And you can see this button, I think it says +1. If you press that, you're basically telling the camera, hey camera, I would like to make a panorama. And it says, okay, and it gives it a number. And I don't know if this will be visible on anyone's screen, but if you look down here, or if you look on your own smart device when you're shooting, you're going to see some text in the bottom right-hand corner of that white area with the controls. It's going to have the property name or the project name, it'll have the floor you're on, and it'll have the pano number that you're on. So when you press +1, it just creates a number for your pano. And this is a good idea to do this. Technically, you can name them, don't bother unless you really want to, but the numbers are good. And they're going to go up sequentially. So we'll come back to that in a minute. But you're going to press the +1, and then you're going to press the shoot button. And that's it. You don't have to turn on the LCD. You don't have to do anything else. So you can actually see here that auto exposure is on and that auto white balance is on. So I'm not going to get into manual exposure adjustment. You can do that if you know how and you want to, go ahead. But with auto exposure on, don't even worry about it. It's just going to take care of it for you. So when you tap the shoot button, you're going to hear the camera click away. It's going to do 3 exposures plus a metering exposure. And then as soon as it's done, it's going to say processing image. As soon as the shutter is done clicking, you can technically rotate it. You don't have to wait for it to appear on screen. But once it's done processing, an image will appear on screen. And then what you're going to do is rotate the camera clockwise to the next position on the detent. Here, I'll even show you what that looks like. So we're going to rotate the camera clockwise to the next position. And then once it's there, we're going to press that shoot button again, the one that looks like a camera. It's going to click a bunch of times, and then a preview will appear on screen. And then we're going to rotate the camera one final time to the last shoot position. And then we're going to press that shoot button for the last time. And then our panorama is done. So I'm going to recap that because I kind of rambled a bit there. So place the camera down, give it a little wiggle, make sure it's level, press +1, press shoot, rotate clockwise to the next position on the rotator, press shoot, and then rotate clockwise to the last position on the rotator and press shoot. So that whole process, start to finish, should take you between 16 and 20 seconds. It's very fast. And most of that time you're just standing there waiting for the camera as it's clicking away, taking images. So what you're going to see while that's occurring is you're going to see very large preview images appear on screen as you shoot them. And each one of those images represents a composite or a combination of 3 images, 3 bracketed images, I think it's middle, under, over, that are taken and then combined to create an HDR preview that you see in real time. And yes, it looks weird because it's a fisheye image. So you can see the tripod and you can see the ceiling and everything. But a completed pano has these 3 little images in the top left-hand corner populated. So in order, 1, 2, and 3. So they represent shots, directions, 1, 2, and 3 in that order. And they're dynamic on the interface. You can actually click on them. And you can look at them and you can pinch and you can zoom in and stuff. So the goal here when you're shooting your panorama, as far as the images, is to make sure that you like what you've got. So this is a pretty terrible example, but you can see windows, you can see highlights that you've captured, and you can really get a feel for if you've actually captured what it is that you think you should be capturing. There's a few extra things in the process that I didn't mention, so I'll just go through those now. So when you're shooting and you're choosing an initial direction to point the camera at, it's always a good idea to pick something important. And the reason you want to pick something important, I've mentioned this I think in every webinar we've done this far, is because the camera is going to decide on an exposure based on what you first pointed at. Because we're doing a 360-degree image, there's no way for the camera to see all of it at once, so it can't meter on everything. You have to pick something. So if you pick something that's important, there's a good chance the whole panorama will work out, because whatever's important will be well exposed. And if other things aren't so great, it's no big deal. The HDR is also going to cover you for most of the highlights and shadows anyway. You can actually see the brackets up here in the top right-hand corner. It's -5 and +2. So that's going to get some pretty good highlights out of the windows and pull a fair amount of detail out of the shadows for you. So when you're choosing your starting position, that also just happens to be the first thing people will see when they click on the panel on the tour. So that means that you don't have to configure it later. So you save yourself some work. When you're choosing your initial shot direction, that can affect the overall exposure greatly. So if I were to, for example, point the camera directly out a window, I'm going to get overall a much darker pano than I would if I were to point the camera directly at, like, say, I don't know, a stone fireplace, let's say. So you can use that to your advantage. And my recommendation, especially when you first start, or even for seasoned pros, is to shoot a panorama, point the camera at something important in the interior, and then if you think it's a little too dark, just try to create another panorama but change the start position. So if you do that, you end up saving a lot of time because you're not fiddling around with the settings. And you also get a series of panoramas that you can choose from later. So in Stitch, you're going to have a bunch of panoramas, and you can look through them and think, oh, that one looks good, and then just turn the rest off. Because you have total control over what people see and what they don't see on the tour by hiding panoramas in Stitch or hiding them later in the iGUIDE portal. And then just to clarify, all of the panoramas that get created that you send in will be visible to the drafters. So they see everything, but you tell them what to show to the public and what not to show the public. So all the panoramas will go for, and the purposes of drafting, will get to be seen by the drafters, but the public won't see the ones that you intentionally hide. All right, cool. So let me just check my notes here. Yeah, let's talk about workflow. You know what, actually, before we move on, I'm going to mention one more thing. So my recommended settings here are lasers on. It looks like they're off here, but that's okay. Auto exposure on and auto white balance on. You're free to turn these off if you want to play around with it, but they're so good. The auto exposure is like rock solid. I've only ever had it fail or be a bit unusual in very strange circumstances where it's almost irrelevant anyway. So I use this example a lot. A lot of you might have already heard it. We were shooting an office building and they had these server rooms and all the racks are all black. So when you bring the camera in, there's nothing to point it at that's not black. So the camera gets really confused because it thinks it's in a dark room, but it's really not. So the exposures are really long. So rather than wait like 15 seconds for an exposure, you can set it manually, and then it won't do that. Auto white balance is fantastic, and it has a huge advantage. So what the camera will do is it will change the white balance depending on the direction that you point it. So you might think, well, that doesn't make sense. If it's changing the white balance based on the direction, then they're not going to line up. They're all going to be weird. You might have one pointed over here that's cool and one pointed over here that's warm. And the answer is, yeah, it actually does do that. But the software developers put a thing in Stitch that will auto equalize the white balance for you. So you actually get better results by changing the white balance rather than keeping it the same throughout the whole panorama, which is sort of funny, but that's just the way it is. So my recommended settings: lasers on, auto exposure on, auto white balance on, and then just +1 and shoot, and you just hit them over and over again. If you forget to turn the lasers on, no big deal. It's going to warn you anyway, so that's really not a problem. But you can choose to disable it if you're going to shoot areas that you don't specifically want drafted, which I mentioned in the previous webinar. So if you're curious about that, go on the forum and have a look. It is there. So the next thing we're going to talk about is workflow. How much time do I have? Oh, I'm already running out of time. Okay, no worries. So workflow. Here's the optimal workflow. This is what it could look like, or should look like, in my opinion, if you show up at a house and you're going to shoot it. So you set up the camera, introduce yourself, and then begin shooting. Shoot your first panorama, just wherever it is you start. So if you've entered the front door, just shoot it there, and then walk to the next space, shoot a panorama there, and then align the data from one space to the next. And we'll get to that in a second. And then follow a logical path throughout the house. Go in whatever order seems to make sense to you, going from room to room until you've covered every space in a property. Once you've got a panorama in every single space, including the weird ones, so don't forget hallways and breezeways and pantries and all that kind of stuff. once you've gone through every single space, look at what you've got and think to yourself, did I get everything? And if the answer is yes, well, then you're good. You can move on to another floor or go home if you're done. Following a logical order that makes sense to you is important because all of your panoramas are going to be sequentially numbered. Because they're sequentially numbered, there's information there if you need to align data after the fact. So just to make that make sense, you'll always know, for example, that panorama 3 is next to panorama number 4. Panorama number 7 is always next to panorama number 8. So when you're putting together, the pieces of the puzzle, if that makes any sense, you'll have some extra information to work with rather than just purely guessing at how it goes together. So I'm going to show you that process in Stitch to a certain degree, because it might be unfamiliar to some people. Whoops, that didn't work. Let's try that again. There we go. All right, so here's a sample property. Yeah, I shot this. Cool. So when you shoot your first pano, just grab my keyboard. It's going to be all on its own. Whoops, sorry, hit a hotkey. It's going to be all on its own, and you're not going to be able to see anything else. Okay. And then when you go shoot your second panorama, you have the option to align that data to your first set of data. So if you haven't shot anything yet, this isn't going to make any sense. But I'm going to help this by adding this panorama. So let's suppose for a moment that you shot your first panorama and that you shot your second. And you think to yourself, I would really like to align that now on site. What you could do is click the Move button. Let's go back here, I'll show you that. Beneath the word Pano. And what you're going to see is that your data that you see, so you can see here, I've got multiple panos, but I can't actually move them because this is not interactive to any great degree. But when you move your data, you're going to see that you've got two overlapping pieces of data, and you can move one so that it basically lines up with the other. There's going to be data in common between the two. Basically, what I'm saying is, as part of an ideal workflow, is aligning data from one panorama to the next as you shoot. And in a perfect world, all shooting would look like that. You would shoot a panorama, and then you would line up the data to the previous data you've collected. Think of it, if you haven't done this before, think of it like putting the pieces of a puzzle together one by one, except it's way easier because you're being handed those pieces in the order that that they go together. The pieces are weird. They look like, strange squiggles and dots, but it's still the same process. You get a piece and you attach it to the rest of the puzzle, and as you build it, what will happen is it will get easier. As the puzzle gets fleshed out, you're going to get closer to just having basically a hole where something goes. So it's most difficult initially when you first start and you don't have any data. And if you follow a logical path through the house and then you happen to have one piece of data that you couldn't align, it's not a big deal. So I can look over here on this folder tree and I can see, oh, that's panel number 4. So number 3, I was here. So I know it must be around here somewhere. So when I come over here, I can kind of wiggle this around and say, oh yeah, it should probably go here. Because there's literally a hole where that should go. Data alignment is a tricky thing. It's the toughest thing the camera can throw at you. Some people are good at it, some people aren't. So what I'll do is I'll just show you a fun trick you can use. So I've got this pano over here. I don't know where it goes. Oh, it's a mystery. I can click this magic magnet button up here, and the software will snap it into place. So even if you don't properly align the data on site, not really a big deal because you can always do it later in the software using the automatic tools or doing it manually by putting the pieces together like a puzzle. In fact, you have an advantage here over doing it on site because you can see the connection between the images and the data. So I think we're kind of running about out of time because I want to answer questions, so I'll just get to this real quick. The data and the images are connected, and that's kind of the magic of the whole system. You can go into a property that's pretty messy and weird and complicated, and you can capture all the data that you need to get really accurate floor plans because you're also capturing images as well as laser measurement data. People often put more importance on this data than on the images, but they're linked, and you need both for floor plans. So just to give you an example, when I look at these squiggles, I kind of get it. There's like maybe a wall here, maybe this is a door, I don't know. But I don't know if you guys can see this. There's a line that follows my cursor. That's called the radar tool. And what that does is it allows me to identify things in the data and in the image at the same time. So if I hover my mouse cursor over the front door, hope you guys can see that, there is a vertical line that corresponds to where my cursor is pointing. So I know that this data is for the front door. So that's really cool, and that's what the drafters use to draw properties. So they don't guess. They don't just say, oh, that's probably a bookshelf. They look at the image and they identify things that aren't structured and they just draw around them. They say, okay, well, there's a bookshelf. We don't want that. And they identify parts on either side. Okay, that's a wall and that's a wall, and they draw a line that goes right around it. It's awesome. All right, cool. So let's really quickly jump to some frequently asked questions. So I get these all the time, and I just want to get them out of the way real quick. Number one, what height should the camera be set to? Everyone always asks me this constantly. It doesn't really matter, to be honest. You can set the camera to whatever height you like. It'll work. Think about it in terms of what the camera can see, though. If the camera's too low, I mean, that's going to be kind of weird. You're going to see under furniture, which might be dirty. It also won't be hitting structure. It'll be hitting couches and chairs and stuff. If the camera's too high, it's going to look strange. Again, you're going to have a strange perspective where it's too tall. Usually a good height is around-ish 4 feet, 3.5 to 4 feet. That's a standard height for real estate photography in general. So that height kind of looks good. The only time where that ever sort of fails is when you're in VR. If you shoot the camera real low and then you switch to VR, sometimes it feels as though you're really short. Something we noticed while we were playing around with it recently. So if you really, really want to focus on VR, you could raise the camera up to about eye level. That's what they recommend. All right, next, how many panos are required? Great question, glad you asked. There is no right or wrong number of panos. So the right number of panos is the exact amount required to create the kind of tour that you want to create. So you need to have minimum a pano in every single space that needs to be measured. So that's everything. So hallways, closets, the whole 9 yards. Every single room or space needs a panorama, but there's no limit. You can create as many panoramas as you want. So if for some weird reason you've got a kind of really interesting living room with, like, I don't know, a bunch of extra features in it. Maybe there's a reading nook and maybe there's a sunken something or other. You can create 3 or 4 panoramas, that's fine. You can also create extra panoramas just to experiment. So if you want to create 5 or 6 in a dining room and just pick the best one, that's cool too. There's nothing wrong with that. When you're creating those panoramas, it's good to know that you can always turn them off. So if you create, 30 panoramas and then later you're looking at the tour and you're like, wow, that was overkill. No big deal. Turn a few of them off. It's fine. I err on the side of caution usually when I'm shooting. So if I've got a room, for example, where I don't know if it should even go on the tour. So some things are cut and dry, right? If I've got a messy walk-in closet, well, I'm not going to show that on the tour. Obviously, I'm going to turn that one off. Or a messy attached garage. Beautiful living room, yeah, obviously I'm going to turn it on. But let's suppose you have a laundry room, and there's like laundry baskets and liquid detergent, and you're thinking, I don't know if people should see this. No big deal, just turn it off. You can always turn it back on later. There's 2 types of phone calls. There's the kind of, questioning phone call, like, oh, hey, I don't see the laundry room. What's up with that? That your client asked you. You say, oh, I could turn it on, but it was a bit messy. And then there's the sort of angry phone call where they call you and they're like, oh my God, you have to turn off that panel of the laundry room. You can see the homeowner's underwear. So I prefer the first one. So I usually turn things off very liberally and try to create a more sparse tour. But that being said, if you want to create something a little more visual and dynamic, you can certainly do that. When you're creating panoramas, you can increase their frequency to whatever you like. So typical would be to walk into a room, put the camera down somewhere near the middle, and shoot 1 pano. That's it, you're done. If you want to create something a little more navigable, you could, in between one room and another, create a panorama in the middle, so that when people are visually navigating, they're not moving forward quite as much. Or you can create several panoramas in the middle. Often panoramas are tied to features or, I guess, points of interest. So in an open concept living, dining, kitchen, study, it's all one big room. You could just do 1 pano and leave. And that would create a very boring virtual tour. So it makes way more sense to create 1 in the kitchen because that's, a purpose and something you want to show. Or create 1 in the dining room and then 1 in the living room. And then you might have 4 panos, 1 for each purpose. So although you could technically measure that space with 1, you probably wouldn't bother because you could do a few extra at very little cost to your time. So breaking big spaces down by purpose is my recommendation. And then adding extra panos in isn't a bad idea either. Next frequently asked question, what rooms need panos in 1 stone? Every single space needs a panorama, regardless of how weird and ugly and silly and pointless you think it is. Especially when you first start. When you first start, shoot everything and overshoot. It never hurts, and you can dial it back a little as you go. When you're shooting, you're going to come across spaces, and you're going to think, do I need a pano there? And the answer is always yes. Because the worst thing that can happen to you with this camera, especially if you're creating something for floor plans, is that you go and you shoot a property and you miss something. Because if you miss something on the property, the drafters won't be able to draw it for you, and then you'll have to go back, and that's very awkward. No one wants that. So when you're shooting and you come across a space where you're not sure, just shoot it anyway. It's only going to cost you 20 seconds, so you might as well. All right. I already talked about data alignment, but I'm just going to clarify so that it's clear to everybody. You can align data on site if you want. That's what we recommend. So as part of an optimal workflow, it's shoot, align, and just repeat. If you want to, though, you can align at home. So you just shoot all your panoramas, keep track of every space you've been to just with your brain. Make sure your panoramas are good, and then do all the alignment later in Stitch, like you can see that I'm doing here. If you do that, you run the risk of not knowing if you've got everything. So that's why it's not the optimal workflow, but it does work. And when people shoot a lot of iGUIDEs, like thousands of them, they get pretty cavalier about it, and they just kind of go shoot it, and they don't worry too much about it anymore. But when you first start, you should probably try to align the data on site. In the real world, it doesn't look like that. The real world is like you're shooting and you're aligning the data and everything's going really great, and then you get really confused and you've got one piece of data and it doesn't make sense, and then you get flustered. If that happens, it's not really a big deal, because you could align maybe half the house, and then when you get home, you could realign the other half. That's okay. So you could partially align it on site as well. And the tools that are built in might align it for you. So if I click the magic magnet here, it just snaps it into place for me anyway. So that's my official recommendation is shoot and align on site. But if you want to align later, that's totally normal, and that happens a lot. All right, I'm going to wrap it up by summarizing what it is you should be concerned about. So whether you've done, one iGUIDE, no iGUIDEs, 1,000 iGUIDEs, you're only ever really worried about the same thing, and that's, did I get everything? So it's really what I call coverage, and there's actually even a coverage button built into Survey when you're looking at the data that will shade it in for you. It doesn't do anything other than just change the way the data looks to give you kind of like a better idea of where you've been. But coverage really means, did you get enough data to make the drafters happy so they can draw the property, and to make your client happy? So the drafters need at minimum one panorama per space, and that's what most people create. But your client, depending on who they are, might want more than that. So if your client is absolutely obsessed with the living room or some feature in it, then they may want a panorama near whatever that feature is. Let's say it's a fireplace, because there happens to be one in this picture. Let's suppose they're over the moon about this thing, and they're like, oh, hope you get that in the tour. So you might create extra panoramas around that fireplace just to suit them, to make them happy. Your client might want a tour that's more like more visual, more like Matterport or Google Street View, in which case, yep, go ahead, create as many panoramas as you want. There's no limit. So if you want to make them happy by creating extra panoramas in between rooms, that's cool. Go right ahead. And if you have, if you're doing it for a real estate listing, which most of you I'm sure are, there are certain things that are really important on a listing. So if I'm shooting a kitchen and I don't capture, I use this example every time, you guys have all probably heard it. If I don't walk around to the other side of the island and do a panorama showing the dishwasher and the wine rack or fridge or whatever, I'm going to get in trouble, because my client's going to say, hey, where's the panorama over here? So you need to capture panoramas in terms of measurement so that you can have the property drafted. But you also need to get enough image data to properly communicate the property or create what your client is looking for when they're listing it or using the iGUIDE for whatever reason. So just an aside, just like a bonus, I'm just going to mention outdoor panos because I know it's going to come up. Yes, you can use the camera outside. You can create as many panoramas as you want. There's no limit. I mentioned it on the previous webinar. So again, go back there and have a look at that one. The drafters will try to draw in exterior structures for you if you can capture any details. So that's things like patios, decks, porches, things like that. So what I mean by that is you may have to raise and lower the camera to capture different details. Like I think I mentioned this earlier, the optimal height for the camera is around like 3.5 to 4 feet, about elbow height. So that might be too high to capture the railing of a deck, for example. So you might have to lower it down to capture that detail if you want the drafters to draw it in. Okay, I'm going to answer questions. Holy smokes, there's a ton of comments here. Let's have a look. Alrighty. So that one's about the banner. Well, I'm not sure what that means, but I'll just say it. So any iGUIDE can be branded. When you're creating the iGUIDE, there's an option to add branding or add a banner. That banner is whatever you want it to be. I recommend that you always add basically a branding information to your iGUIDEs because it becomes really awkward when you want to find your iGUIDEs later if you don't add your agents to them. Some people use single property websites and they embed the iGUIDE so they don't see branding as being that important. But if you don't have the iGUIDE, if you don't have the agent's name attached to the iGUIDE and you try to like look up all the iGUIDEs by, you know, Linda or something later, you won't be able to find them because they don't have that data associated with them. Is there benefit to the viewfinder being covered? The cover that came with my IMAX 5 slid out and got lost. Good question, Leroy. I knew you'd have a good one. That is funny. So the answer is, no, it doesn't matter. It can get lost. The only risk with regards to the viewfinder cover is that you could, in theory, have light leakage. So with a really long exposure, if there was a bright light source behind the camera that could shine into the viewfinder, it could internally reflect and it could affect the image quality. But why would that doesn't even make sense because basically in an environment like a property, if it was really, really dark and you were trying to take a panorama, it wouldn't be dark if you were holding a light behind the camera because it would be reflected in the room. That really only affects like long exposures that are like done outdoors. Either way, no, it doesn't matter. Just forget you ever had it. I lost mine as well. They just fall off. Just toss it in the box and forget it exists. No, it doesn't come with a QR plate. So what tripod you choose and what QR plate you choose is completely up to you. And it's really like, if you want to be really nerdy about it, you don't choose a tripod. Your tripod chooses you. Okay. Actually, I'll show you guys my tripod. I've had this one forever. I've had lots of tripods, but I always come back to this one. It's a Manfrotto 190 Pro B. I think everyone owns this tripod. It was really popular for a bit. The updated model is really corny looking, in my opinion. And it's there you go. It's like this. And like I've met tons of people with the same tripod, but it's good. Anyway, it's held up. It's great. Fun tip for anyone who's new. Take your tripod. Okay, you ready for this? This is a good one. And loosen one leg so that whenever you lift the tripod, it automatically folds in. I dropped my mouse. When you do that, you'll be able to walk through doorways really easily and only extend one leg. So 2 legs stiff and 1 leg loose, and you'll be able to just pick up the tripod, walk with it with the iGUIDE camera, and then just put it down real fast. I've shot like thousands of properties. But yeah, the tripod just needs to be heavy. You need to like it. The QR plate's going to vary depending on which one you choose. I don't know why I started with Manfrotto, but you can get the RC2 quick plates for cheap. There's the Arca Swiss ones. It doesn't matter. They're all pretty much the same. It's whatever attachment system you kind of buy into is the one you'll probably stick with. Yeah, having multiple batteries is very handy. I used to run 2. I had a really cheap knockoff one. It was terrible, and it got puffy, and it only lasted like a day. Chris, can you review under what conditions you would change the bracketing system? Right, so good question. You have access to the brackets, and you can modify them if you want. So the only time you would ever do that is if you have a really challenging scenario. There are 2 ways to modify it. One is by using the presets. I don't know if I can show that to you guys. Oh, you can, yep. So you can see here on screen that it says HDR Indoor. If you click that, there's going to be a series of presets, including custom. And the presets will actually change what you see up here. So you'll actually see them, appear as you're shooting to give you an idea. The only time you would ever really change them is when you encounter a very challenging scenario like a beach that's bright white with an interior that's like really dark brown leather. So you've got really extreme highlights and really extreme shadows. So you just have to make the camera work harder when you do that. So often you'll switch it. So instead of a -5 +2, you might use +3 -3, or you might swap it around. The best way to get good results in that scenario is to use that technique I mentioned earlier, shoot facing the interior, see what you get. Then shoot facing the exterior as a starting position, I should say, see what you get. And then if you're really desperate, change the bracket settings. Often what you're trying to do with brackets is maintain or retain highlights. So I don't know why real estate photographers get so hung up on highlights. Like 90% of the time, depending on where you live, I'll say that, the highlights are crap. Like, if you look out the window, it's like a brick wall or, nothing that's like important. So often what happens is you struggle to retain these highlights, but then if you really look out the window, what you're really working to get or to keep in your windows isn't any good anyway. So you only should have to modify the bracket settings to retain the highlights in the windows, like infrequently, unless you live in a beautiful area. Like if you're in BC and there's like mountains through every window, then sorry, you're out of luck. You have to work harder. But if you live in an urban area where it's not that big a deal, like often even in beautiful areas, when you look out the windows, there's like maybe a tree, maybe some sky, like it's really not that exciting. But anyway, that's when you would do it, when you have really intense differences between highlights and shadows. Sorry, I didn't mention this. In the presets, there's a custom setting. So the way you change the brackets to be custom, like whatever you want, is by clicking the Manage. Is that on screen? There you go. Manage tab at the bottom. And then there's a setting for custom brackets. So you can set it to anything you like, even weird stuff. You want -7, +7? Go ahead, give it a try. Often bracketing is a personal taste thing, and it's also highly dependent on the circumstances you're in. So I can't say to you, you need to use these settings. I mean, they're in the presets essentially anyway, our recommendations, but you'll have to experiment and try on site. So if that's something that you're interested in, I recommend that you just play around with it one day. It's not that complicated. Give it a try and see what you can come up with. But you're going to have to basically change it for every scenario. And it's really a case of experimentation. Shoot and kind of look at what you got and think, is that any better? Or, am I getting what I need here? All right, let's move on. Yeah, definitely look for reflective surfaces. I didn't mention mirrors. For anyone that's new, mirrors are a pain. I'll just dive into it right now. Why not? I think I have time. Hold on. Do I? Oh, yeah, tons of time. Mirrors are frustrating in the sense that if you're in the reflections, that can be sort of unprofessional, or if the camera is. But the data is also just nonsense. So often when you're capturing data with mirrors, you can't measure the mirror surface. You're measuring whatever's reflected in the mirror surface. So good news, the drafters don't care. They look at the image. So as I mentioned earlier, the images and the data are linked. So when the drafters see something weird, they just look at the image and they go, oh, it's a mirror. And they just draw over it. They don't care. For you, it's frustrating as a photographer because you're trying to align that data, and sometimes it's nonsense when there's a mirror. So it's much harder. And also you're trying to stay out of the reflections. So my recommendation, I have two hot tips. First one is always try to stay just outside of the mirror if you can. Sometimes you can't, but if you can, just stay just outside of it, and that's totally okay. So a powder room, for example, not a whole lot in there. There's a vanity maybe, you point the camera at that, and then just stay just in the doorway, and that's totally acceptable to start. And if you can't do that, try to find something to hide behind. I made a speed sort of demonstration video in time-lapse on the iGUIDE site, and in it, I actually hide the camera behind a candlestick. It worked out really well. Also, when you're hiding the camera, if you can find like a vase of twigs or toilet or not toilet paper, paper towel roll or something to hide the camera behind. Often, if like a little bit of the camera is sticking out, it's not a big deal. Nobody knows what the camera is, so it's not as big a deal as having the camera full front and center. But then failing all that, no big deal. You can always edit the images later, and you can clone or content-aware fill the camera out in Photoshop in post if you need to. My screen looks different than the one shown. The shoot button is not blue. Oh, that's an excellent question. So the shoot button will not be blue until the camera is connected, powered up, and you've pressed +1. So there's some color indicators here. So I didn't mention any of this stuff, but there's a lot of visual feedback built right into the system to make things easier. So let's suppose for a moment that your camera icon is red. So what that means, it means a few different things. One, it could mean that there's no battery in the DSLR, so it's just not on. It could mean that it is literally not physically turned on. It might be on off. You'll need to turn it to M mode or to on, depending on the version that you have. Or it could mean that the camera is disconnected. So let's suppose, God forbid, the camera fell over and smashed the cable out of the side. Well, then it's not physically connected, so it won't work. The most common reason we've been seeing that lately is that when people first get their cameras, and don't be embarrassed if you do this, because like I said, it's very common, is that people go into the menu of the DSLR and they turn on the Wi-Fi. So if you've done that, go back into the menu of the DSLR and turn it off. Because what that does is it basically says to the camera, I'm going to connect you via Wi-Fi, and it disconnects from the system controller. There's a bunch of notes about it in training in certain places, but they're kind of easy to miss. Either way, if you see that that camera icon is red, that means that the DSLR body can't communicate to the system controller. So you just need to run through that checklist. If you are desperate, you can always call into support, but I believe there is a knowledge base article about that specific problem, so I'll link it if I can find it. Choose the best option of camera setup, software, etc. for your business. That's a little vague. I don't know how to answer that. Architectural technician. Yeah. So that's complicated, Craig. We're going to have to talk after, have a phone call with Michael, because that's very broad and that's outside the scope of this webinar. But I will say the point cloud is available, so you can have DXF output at the end. So when you've created your iGUIDE, you can go into the back end and you can download the DXFs, and they contain point cloud that you can use if you want. If homeowners want certain features highlighted, can we take shots of those and include in the overall interactivity of the presentation? Okay, Robert. Well, the answer is absolutely yes. When you are, so I'll mention still images, but when you're shooting the tour, proximity is what's important. So you need to have panoramas near things that are important. This is not the right camera for detail shots, but if you want to use a separate camera system to do something like that, you go right ahead. So I'll give you an example. When I shoot, I have a wide angle lens, and then I also have a 50mm lens. So when I want to do like those dumb shots of like a faucet with shallow depth of field, I'll set it to 1.8 and I'll shoot a photo. And yep, absolutely, you can totally include those in the gallery if you want to. Cabinets, cookware, yep, all that stuff. Any still images, this is what I should have said actually, can be added to the gallery. So the iGUIDE includes a gallery. It is unpopulated by default, so you have to put images in it. Otherwise, it doesn't do anything. The camera doesn't automatically make images for you. You have to select them and place them there, but they can be any images you want, and you can add them at any time. So what that means is you can use a separate camera to create still pictures of whatever you like. You can use the iGUIDE camera to create still pictures of whatever you like. You can use anything you want, or your phone. Totally up to you. Oh, that's a good one. How critical is alignment? In some cases, the shape is similar, but not the same. So the data that you're putting together resembles the final floor plan, but obviously it's pretty different. So when you're aligning the data, think of it like this. You need to be able to look at it and kind of say, okay, that looks like a floor plan. That's good enough. You need to make sure all the rooms are like as close to aligned as you can get them at a zoomed out sort of level. So technically, yes, you could zoom in and stitch, and you could really finely and precisely line it. Don't bother. Not a big deal. The drafters are going to tear it all apart and reassemble it perfectly anyway. But the rooms need to be, or the data needs to be relatively well assembled so that the drafters can figure it out. Because they didn't go to the property, so they don't know what it looks like to the same degree you do. So if you assemble it just, relatively close to where it is, where the data is supposed to go, so it looks well aligned when zoomed out, that's fine. Do you account for wall thickness when aligning? Nope, don't care about it. Wall thickness has no bearing on anything other than the final calculation. So when you first start, I didn't mention any of this, by the way, but it is important. When you first start creating a project, you want to add the exterior wall thickness by measuring it at the front door of the home. If that's available, that's going to be an easy representative place to do it. And we're talking from the inside of the property, so like the paint on the wall, excluding trim and molding and all that, to the outside of whatever the exterior sheathing is typically. So that's from the paint to the outside of the brick or siding. It's just a number, you just put it in, that's it. What do you call the horizontal line? Should I be concerned about it? I don't know which horizontal line. Is it the one in Stitch that's like in the image? No, that's a simulated representation of what the laser is hitting. That's just there for your reference. You can totally ignore that. All right. Can you change height between panos? Absolutely. You can change the height of the camera to be whatever you want. And you may change it multiple times throughout a property. It's a good idea to keep the camera height around your elbow height, 3.5 to 4 feet, somewhere in that zone. Depends on how tall you are. Throughout most of the property, and then raise or lower it depending on circumstances. So I'll give you a few examples. You're in a kitchen, you've got really beautiful countertops. Okay, raise the camera up. Then you can see down on the countertops. You're in a garage and there's a bunch of cars and they're in your way. Okay, raise the camera up above the cars and measure over top. Or you're on the second floor and there's a half wall. And you really want to measure that because you want to make sure the drafters get that data. Okay, lower the camera down. And then you can hit that little half wall. The height of the camera is going to affect what you measure and also what you see. So that's why I said earlier, if you lower the camera down too far, things get a little weird because you can see under furniture and it creates an unnatural perspective. So to keep a nice looking pano with a nice even floor to ceiling ratio, you want to keep it, around the 3.5 to 4 feet zone, but you're free to raise and lower the camera to whatever you want, to whatever height you're comfortable with, or you think would be beneficial for your pano. How do you tell if there is missing information? Good question. There's a few different ways. So one way is to just look at the data and in your head kind of think about where you've been and where you haven't been. Well, whether you look at the data or not. So when I'm shooting still pictures of a property, for example, I don't have anything to go by other than the pictures themselves. So I just have to kind of just remember where I've been. When you're shooting data, you get lots of feedback. So if you align it as you go, and you kind of follow that logical progression that I mentioned, you shouldn't really miss anything because you'll be building the floor plan piece by piece, and you'll always just go to the next room, so you won't accidentally skip one, hopefully. If you do that, you're unlikely to miss something. But that's why I mentioned earlier in the workflow, a really important thing is at the very end, have a look at your data and think to yourself, did I get everything? And if there's any doubt in your mind, just go back to wherever it is you think you might have missed and shoot another panorama. Going back and spending an extra, 15 minutes shooting a few extra panoramas is nothing compared to driving back, 2 days later, capturing extra data, then going back home, then resubmitting it. It's a huge hassle. So to avoid that, yes, be very thorough, especially when you're first starting. Also, there's the coverage button. So when you're looking at the data, I'll bring that back up again. When you're looking at this screen in Survey, if you tap this coverage button up here, I don't know if you guys can see my cursor, it will shade everything in. So you can use that as a reference. It will shade in areas that you've measured, and areas that you haven't measured will be black. How critical is the wall thickness at the beginning of the shoot? It doesn't matter when you do it. So I don't know if it's the critical is the thickness part or the beginning part, but you can add it whenever you like. You can also add it later in Stitch or even later on the portal. How important that is really depends. Wall thickness is important for most listings because it gives you what's called the gross floor area, or what we call the exterior area. So we take that wall thickness, we can get technical for a second here, and we multiply it by the interior perimeter to get the area occupied by the exterior walls. So most agents like to list with that number when they're listing the house. It's a bigger number, and it's fair because they're selling the whole house, including the bricks. So, there's nothing wrong with that. If you don't include that, often the square footage numbers will be a little lower than they should be, which might cause some concern. It's not a problem. It just means that you might get questioned. The only time you would not include exterior wall thickness is when the property is attached in any way. So if it's a condo, well, they don't own their walls, not in the same way as a house. So you just skip it. You don't need to include it at all. And if you are shooting something that's like a semi-detached house, like a townhouse or something, also leave it out because it's also irrelevant. All right, turnaround time for drafters. Next business day. It's always next business day. So if you shoot on a Wednesday, you're going to get your tour, floor plans, and the whole 9 yards back on a Thursday. So shoot on a Wednesday, get it back on a Thursday. The only exception is if you shoot it on a Saturday, you won't get it on a Sunday, you'll get it the following Monday. So it's always next business day, except we don't draft on Sundays, so not on Saturday. How long for me snapping shots until fully prepared virtual tour for the realtor? Well, same thing, right? It's always next business day. So often the question is, well, what time during the day? And the answer is, I don't know, and we don't know often. So when you submit your data, let's say at 5 p.m., I'll demystify this process for you. It goes into our system and it gets basically put in what you could look at as like a hopper. And then it's going to sit there until the following day at 7 a.m. Eastern time, and then it's going to be sent to someone to process. After it's been initially drafted, it's then going to be sent through a process of QA where it gets checked a bunch of times, and then it will get sent out. So that could happen. So you might have someone look at your data at 7:30. It might go through QA at 9, and you might get your tour by 10. That could happen. Or you might have someone get your data at 2 p.m. and then they might, process or draft it and then have it sent to QA, and you might get it at 4 p.m. So it's kind of all over the place. Typically, it's earlier rather than later because the drafters do work 7 to 3 Eastern time. Also depends on the time zone that you're in. So that's going to affect the time. Most of the time, what you'll find, though, is that it's pretty early in the day, relatively speaking. I can't confirm that 100%, but usually that's what it is. I mean, before 5 p.m., that is to say, except during peak times where it's going to be more erratic, just because volume is much higher. So maybe you submitted your data at 5 p.m. the previous day, but maybe 7,000 people submitted their data at 4:30. So they're all ahead of you, and there's no way for you to really know that. Can we set the default view so all floor plans have colors instead of setting it every time? Yes, Cindy, absolutely, you can totally do that. So in the portal, if you click on the button in the top right-hand corner that has your name, a little drop-down will come down. It'll say Settings. If you click that, you can go to, I think it's iGUIDE Defaults, and you can set the floor plan colors to whatever you want. And you can independently set them for the PDFs and the viewer. So for some weird reason you want cool PDFs, but you want a balanced or warm viewer, you can totally do that. Do you need to open every closet and scan inside for the drafters? Answer, yes. The answer technically is no, not every closet, but for the most part, you should anyway, because it's very thorough. So internal closets aren't super critical, because if you've measured every room around the closet, well, then you've essentially measured the closet. The real troublemakers are the ones on the perimeter. So if they're on the outside of the house on the perimeter, we don't know how deep they are. So you should definitely scan them so that the drafters can accurately draw them in. If you have time, talk about auto mapping. Okay, we'll talk about auto mapping. Auto mapping doesn't save you time really. It's not necessarily a good idea for some people, but some people love it. So just to clarify, auto mapping is a mode where if you turn it on, you can walk around and measure without capturing images. So I'll just get this right out of the way right now. That data is not useful for the drafters because it doesn't have images associated with it. We can't use it to draw anything, so it gets tossed out. But you may find it useful for you because the camera, as you're doing that auto mapping, will create a floor plan upon which it will try to align any panoramas that you capture. So sometimes it will automatically do the work for you. But often what happens is it takes longer to walk around and do the auto mapping mode than it just does to manually move the data in place yourself. And what happens is that the auto map mode can get lost. And if it gets lost, you'll have to fix it. You'll have to reposition it. And the action of repositioning it is the same one as moving data to place rooms. So you're doing the exact same amount of work, just making sure the auto map doesn't get lost as you would be if you were just putting the rooms in place. That being said, auto map is fun. And it can be useful for some people. So if you're really struggling when you're looking at the data and you think, oh, I don't really know what I'm looking at, what you'll find is that auto map might give you a leg up because you can do a whole property and you can see the whole finished thing if you're willing to put the time in. Usually only takes about 10-15 minutes, depends on how fast you walk. And that might make it easier for you to kind of understand what it is you're looking at. How does missing data show up in coverage? Oh yeah, so when you tap coverage, what'll happen is missing areas that are missing will be black. So, and they're in every property. You'll see them like cupboards and things. There'll be these black areas where there's no data. It will look better the more data you have. So if you have more sparse panoramas, it won't look quite as good, or the better aligned it is as well. What is the learning curve for a newbie? First shots for uploading? It depends. Everybody's a little different. You can get up and running in one day, no problem. All it really takes is familiarity with the camera, but people's comfort level really depends on a lot of things. Like a lot of people really struggle doing things that other people just take to very naturally. So a lot of it, for example, you might not even think about, like putting a quick release plate on a tripod. That's like not really a very challenging thing by my reckoning, but some people find that very difficult. So it really depends on your skill level. Another thing that can be very challenging is really working with the data and working with two-dimensional representations of space. So some people are very good at reading maps and some people are not. It's a brain thing. So if you're good at reading maps, you can get up and running in like a couple hours and be very comfortable at your first shoot. If you're not really good at reading maps, you're going to struggle a little bit more, but it's still just going to take a few shoots before you're like, this is easy. There's nothing else to teach you. The system in general is photographically extremely simple. Like it's fixed aperture, it's fixed focus, it's fixed ISO. You don't really modify anything. You just push a button and rotate the camera. And as long as you're pretty careful about where you're keeping the camera in the detents, you're going to get lots of good data and you'll be fine. Most of the time, what happens is that people do somewhere between 5 and 10 properties, and that's it. Like they're good. There's nothing else for the camera to really teach you at that point. All right, cool. I think I've gone a little bit over. Let me check. Oh, I have by 8 minutes. Okay, cool. Well, thanks everybody. Really appreciate you all showing up. That was awesome. I'm going to post this to the forum and the recording, sorry, for this webinar. And I'll post some links to any relevant knowledge base articles. If you haven't used the forum, please go there and look around. There's lots of good stuff there. Also check out our marketing catalog. So if you go to goiGUIDE.com and click on resources, there's lots of fun stuff there that you guys can have access to market your iGUIDEs. All right, cheers everybody. Thanks so much. Have a great evening.